So again, those tools that you might want to take with you if you're going on a walk or a hike and you know that you'll be paying attention to wildflowers. I always like to bring a camera. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but this way, right, I often don't always remember what I've seen, and often I'm places where I wouldn't want to collect wildflowers because it's not my property, it's public property, and so a camera, right, a photo is a way to take that flower home with you, right? So when I'm taking a picture, I'm going to take a picture of the flower itself, the leaves of the plant, and the way the leaves are arranged, which we'll get into in just a little. And that way I can take that picture home, and if I'm not able to figure it out when I'm outdoors, I can go back through my photos later and figure out what I've seen. Other things I like to take with me are just a magnifying lens. So I have kind of a handy dandy magnifying lens that I'll share with you here. This is what it looks like, and it actually comes with a little light, and it was not expensive. It's got different levels of magnification, and this is really helpful for seeing those tiny parts of a flower or tiny parts of a plant, right? Maybe the fuzzy hairs on a leaf. So I like to bring a magnifying lens with me for those purposes. Again, doesn't have to be anything fancy. Instead of a magnifying lens, a jeweler's loupe will work just fine. So that's what I have here as well, either or, just something to help you look at those teeny tiny parts. I know even at my age, my eyes are starting to have a hard time seeing the tiniest bits of plants. They just, no matter how much I squint, they're still blurry. So I imagine that's only going to get worse as I age, and things like this certainly help. And then finally, I will say, if you do have, your own property or you're going to be collecting plants, certainly pressing plants is an option, drying them and pressing them. So that's what's back here. This is sort of an old-fashioned plant press. It doesn't have to be anything that's fancy. If you've collected wildflowers, you want to dry them and press them to look at them later or to use them for an art project or a craft project. Just a really heavy old book and some layers of newspaper will work just fine. But plant presses like this are available. And again, I would only encourage this if you'll be collecting wildflowers on your own property or you have the property owner's permission to do so. Okay. Do we have any questions so far? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to get started here. All right, so hopefully you should be able to see the slides of my presentation. Should be a slide that says Beginner's Wildflower ID. If you cannot see that, please speak up now so I know that you are not seeing what the rest of the group is seeing. If I hear silence, I'm going to keep going and assume that everybody can see what I'm seeing, and we're in good shape to continue. All good? Everybody good? Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate that feedback. Okay. So tonight, again, we're going to be talking about wildflowers, and that means we are not going to be looking at trees, shrubs, or vines, although a number of trees, shrubs, and vines do flower, right? That's what we're looking at over here on the right are various flowers from different native trees in our area, tulip, poplars, dogwoods, maples, and oaks. But we aren't going to be looking at flowers from trees this evening. We're just going to be looking at flowers from herbaceous plants, right? Not plants with a woody stem, no twigs, no trunks, right? Just a soft stem. So our herbaceous plants. Again, we're looking at flowers. We're going to be taking a look at flowers that are growing in the wild without current human interference. I would say the caveat to that being if you've got a native plant garden at home or you know someone who does, right, they are growing plants that can be found in the region, have been here for a long time. And so you will find some of the plants that we talk about tonight in gardens. But again, we're looking at plants that kind of grow on their own, right? And then the plants that we're going to take a look at tonight could be native, introduced, or invasive. And briefly, I just want to talk about the differences between native, introduced, and invasive. A native plant is a plant that comes from our region and has evolved with the insects and other wildlife in our area. An introduced plant comes from elsewhere in the world. It doesn't necessarily, though, cause any harm. And so when we think about introduced plants, we can think about things like dandelions, right? They're not native to our area, but they also don't really cause a ton of harm to other wildlife or other flora. They're just kind of here and they're here to stay. So we consider plants like dandelions introduced. And then finally, we have plants that we would consider invasive. So these are plants that have come from other locations in the world, and they do cause ecological or economic harm. Right, so they are making things difficult for the native plants, the native wildlife that is here, and really, you know, just cause that type of harm. A lot of times you'll hear the word invasive used for plants that are a little aggressive, but those two terms mean very different things, right? So invasive really means that plant causes or animal causes ecologic or economic harm. Okay, and I have included some of these species tonight because they are some of the flowers that we see regularly. Okay, so there's no sense in excluding them if we're interested in learning more about the wildflowers we can find in our region. So where we are going tonight, we are first going to take a look at flower arrangement and what we call flower parts. So we'll do a little practicing together to get the hang of it. Then we're going to talk about leaf presence, right? Whether or not a plant has leaves, the arrangement of those leaves, and then the shape of those leaves and what the edges or margins of those leaves look like. And these are sort of the three key things that we are going to focus on tonight to help us learn how to identify wildflowers, right? This is our framework: the flower arrangement or parts, the leaf presence, and then the leaf arrangement and shape. Okay, there will be obviously other identifying characteristics when we're thinking about wildflowers, right? The color of the flower can be a huge component. How large the plant is, right? Tall, broad, wide. When we start kind of trying to narrow things down and figure out exactly what species things are, sometimes it depends on how tall the plant is. The time that the plant emerges in the spring or the time that the flowers bloom can provide some clues. And then the habitat, right? The location where the plant thrives. Is it near a stream, or is it in a sunny field, or maybe in a shaded forest, right? That can also inform what we are looking at. Okay? All right. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to jump right in. Again, if you have questions as we go along tonight, please, please, please feel free to unmute and share your question or share a story. Also feel free to type things into the chat. Just know that I'm not going to be able to check the chat until the end of the program tonight. Okay. So to begin, when we're thinking about wildflowers, one way we can think about the flowers and start to sort of key out what we're looking at is to think about how the flowers are arranged on the plant. And this is what we call a plant's inflorescence. We're not going to dive too deeply into this tonight, but I do want you to be thinking about it because different families of plants have different ways that their flowers are arranged, right? If we look up on the top right here, you can see this inflorescence called a catkin. This is going to be really common in our oak trees, right? Maybe we're looking at an inflorescence called an umbel, and that's going to be really common in a lot of the plants in our carrot family, right? Like our Queen Anne's lace or other similar plants like dill and parsley. Maybe, right, our plant, excuse me, has flowers arranged in an inflorescence called a corymb, and this is going to be common in flowers like our yarrows. So really just starting to recognize that plants can be organized and or flowers can be organized and arranged on a plant in certain ways and patterns, and those patterns you start eventually to notice, right? Oftentimes related or similar plants will have inflorescences that are also similar. Okay, that's really all I wanted to say about this tonight. I feel like as you learn more, this will become more clear, right? You can look at a plant and be like, oh, those flowers are arranged in a spike. So based on what I have seen, right, about other flowers that are arranged in a spike, chances are it could be related to that. So it's kind of like a clue, right, that helps us get a little bit closer. What we're really going to focus on when it comes to flowers are how many regular parts your flowers have. And this language and this way of thinking about flowers comes straight from the Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, which of all the wildflower guides out there, I find to be the most accessible. It's the one that I first used when I was interested in learning more about wildflowers, and it's what helped me really begin to learn my wildflowers. And so this idea of regular parts refers to whether or not a flower has bilateral symmetry or radial symmetry. So in Newcomb's language, a flower with regular parts is a flower that has radial symmetry, which I'll show you in just a minute, okay? Flowers that have bilateral symmetry or no symmetry at all, which is pretty rare, right, are what we call irregular flowers in Newcomb's language, okay? And when we're thinking about regular versus irregular, right, having that radial symmetry or having bilateral symmetry, we're really looking at the parts of the flower that appear to be like petals, okay? And we can get more into this in a minute, right? We know when we look at a flower, not every single part is a petal, right? But petal or petal-like parts, okay? And there will be instances where flowers are too tiny, even with the help of a jeweler's loupe or a magnifying glass or a camera, to distinguish those different parts. And so we put those flowers into a different category for identification purposes. Is everybody clear on the differences here, taking a look at the pictures between radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry? Right, when we're looking at a flower that's bilaterally symmetrical, it's identical on either side, the same way our faces are, sort of. But when we're looking at a flower that we would call regular, we're looking at a flower that has that radial symmetry. So we could sort of turn that flower 360 degrees and have sort of different parts, right, appear the same. Does that make sense? So we're looking at like a starfish versus a butterfly. Okay, and then these two images also include something called spherical symmetry, which is symmetry the way a ball is symmetrical in like every dimension, right, three-dimensionally. We're not going to worry about that for flowers. Okay. So I included this little piece, what about composite flowers? Composite flowers are things like dandelions, daisies, thistles, sunflowers that appear to be one flower, but are actually comprised of lots of teeny tiny flowers. And we can see that in the sunflower, right? The flowers are actually these tiny bits in the center. And then we've got what appear to be petals on the outside, but right, are actually the ray-like part of the flower, okay? So when it comes to composite flowers and thinking about composite flowers in terms of numbers of parts and whether or not those parts are bilaterally symmetrical or radially symmetrical, obviously these plants are radially symmetrical, and when we're going to count the parts, we don't need to count every single little individual flower here, and we're not looking necessarily at each individual teeny little flower in a composite flower. We're counting the parts that look like what we would call petals. So in the case of a thistle, we might say, ooh, too many to count. In the case of a dandelion, like we're seeing in the center, we might say, okay, so those are parts that are radially symmetrical that I could count if I sat there and tried to count them, right? But that's a lot, so we'll get to that. And then we've got our sunflower, same thing, right? It's got these ray flowers on the edges, what we would sort of colloquially call petals, and we can count those petals individually, right? And recognize that a sunflower has that radial symmetry. So it doesn't matter whether it's a composite flower that has the disc flowers only, a composite flower that has the ray flowers only. We're just counting the parts that appear to be like petals. Does that make sense? We'll do some practicing in just a little bit, okay? So we're going to give it a try here. This is a plant called Maiden's Tears. It is non-native. There are other native plants similar to it in this Silene genus. And it's got an interesting shape, right? So when we're looking at it, we can tell it is certainly radially symmetrical. But if you were to encounter this plant on a walk and you had to start thinking about, okay, how many parts does this flower have to help me identify it? What would you say? How many parts does this flower have? Any thoughts?
Three.
Okay, three is a good guess, right? These are not the best pictures, in that we're seeing maybe like one petal-like structure here, a second petal-like structure here, a third petal-like structure here. I'm going to focus on this one, which allows us to see sort of all the petal-like structures at the same time. And what I'm counting is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petal-like structures. Does that make sense?
I was counting the little blob in the back.
The little blob in the back. Awesome. So you were counting maybe the petal-like structures, the blob-like part in the back, and then the stamens and the pistils that are coming out. Okay. So again, when we're thinking about parts of the flower, for those of us that have studied flowers and flower parts before, we're going to kind of set that botanical understanding of flower parts to the side and just think about it in terms of I'm counting the parts of the flower that appear to be like petals. Does that help?
Definitely.
Okay, so in this case, it would be 5, right? So if we're using our Newcomb's guide, we could turn to the part of the book that shows us flowers that have 5 regular parts, right? And again, parts meaning like things that look like petals. Okay, so 5 parts that look like petals. Okay, so this is, again, one of the ingredients we need to start identifying our wildflowers. So let's practice on this as well. This is chicory. Beautiful, non-native but not invasive flower that opens to the sun. You find it growing along roadsides. Often it likes kind of weedy and places where the soil is maybe compacted or poor. So you often find it growing along the road. It can really thrive in some not great soil. So if we had to count these petal-like parts, how many do you see?
I think I see 8.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm actually counting 9 or 10, and we'll get to that because we're really only going to go up to we go from what we look at, plants that are irregular, don't have that radial symmetry, and then make our way upwards to plants that have at least 7 parts or more. So our chicory would fall into that 7 petal-like parts, 7 or more petal-like parts that can be counted easily. Okay.
Maddie, as a bonus, can you tell us the name of that bug?
I don't know the name of that bug. I actually did look it up at some point. This is why cameras are so great. You can capture that. I don't even think I noticed the bug when I was taking the picture because I was so focused on the chicory.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah, I looked it up at home and unfortunately I don't remember, but I've got it somewhere. So if I send out my email tomorrow with a follow-up, I'll try to include what that beetle is.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we're going to cover again, we're going to take a look at petal-like parts and different flowers that have different numbers of petal-like parts in a minute here, but I did want to talk about those other ingredients or other pieces of the framework that we need when we're thinking about identifying wildflowers. And the second big one, if we're kind of ignoring the flower part of our wildflowers, is to take a look at the leaf arrangement. So we want to ask ourselves, are there leaves, right? There are wildflowers that bloom without any leaves. And if so, right, where are they? Does the plant only have leaves down at the bottom, which is what we call our basal arrangement, right, close to the bottom? Or are the flowers placed along the stem at different intervals, right? They could be whorled and that the leaves sort of circle the stem all the way around. They could be what we call alternate, so they sort of zigzag, right? First there's a leaf on one side, then a little further up the stem there's a leaf on the other side, then there's a leaf on the first side again, then there's a leaf on that other side again. Or the leaves are what we call opposite, so they're placed directly opposite one another on the stem. And all of our wildflowers are going to fall into one of these categories, right, in terms of leaf arrangement. Really, any plant will, right? It's either going to have no leaves when the wildflower is emerging. It's going to have basal leaves, leaves that are whorled, leaves that are alternate, or leaves that are opposite one another along the stem. Okay, so we're going to take a look, right? Wildflowers with no leaves or basal leaves only include our violets, our orchids, our sundews, which are some of our carnivorous plants, blue-eyed grasses, and wild onions. Those are just some quick examples. Obviously, there are more that fall into this category, but those are the ones that I thought you might encounter most often.
Would cancer root flowers be part of that group?
Yeah, cancer root's tough because it doesn't, I mean, it's such an unusual flower. But yeah, I would put them in that group, and I can double check to be sure, but yeah, I would put cancer root into that group.
Thank you.
Wildflowers with opposite leaves include our milkweeds, our sunflowers, our beggar ticks, or sometimes they're known as bidens. Plants in the mint family, our turtleheads, our bluets, our toothworts, and our phlox all have opposite leaves. Wildflowers with whorled leaves include our bedstraws, which is pictured down here, our trilliums, a number of our lilies, and our jopai weeds. Okay. And then finally, wildflowers with alternate leaves includes everything else. So like is the case with trees, right? Plants that have, you know, basal leaves only, opposite leaves, and whorled leaves are kind of the exceptions. Everything else is going to fall into that category where they have alternate leaves. So down at the bottom, we've got some examples. Oh, sorry, I moved this back by accident. On the left here with basal leaves only is our pink lady slipper. This is probably the largest orchid in our area. I just found this blooming just earlier this week. Unfortunately, not here at Gulf Branch. It was at Merkle Wildlife Sanctuary over in Upper Marlboro in Maryland, but beautiful, beautiful orchid. And you can see those leaves are only coming right at the bottom of the plant. You don't find any leaves along the stem leading up to the flower itself. Opposite leaves, we're taking a look at swamp milkweed here in the garden at Gulf Branch. A little tough to see in the photo, but the leaves are arranged opposite one another along the stem. We've got bedstraw here. If you have bedstraw in your garden, you know it kind of sticks to everything. It's a fuzzy plant. It's got little hairs on it that work like Velcro and just stick to everything, although it is native. It does have the tendency to creep over everything, and it has very distinctly whorled leaves, right? Those leaves totally circle the stem at different intervals as we make our way up to the flowers. And then finally, just as an example of a plant with alternate leaves, we've got yarrow, and you can see here's a leaf, right? And then we make our way to the other leaf, right, as we move up the stem towards the flowers. Okay. Let's do a little practicing, right? We're looking at the leaves of the creamfly orchid, which we do have here at Gulf Branch. And what do we think? Are these leaves alternate, opposite, whorled, or basal leaves? Any thoughts?
Basil?
Yeah, these are basal leaves. We're not seeing the flower yet on our creamfly orchid here. We're just seeing the leaves a little bit earlier in the year. And like most orchids, right, those leaves only appear at the very bottom of the plant. Eventually, the flower will grow on a stalk, and that stalk will have no leaves attached to it. All right, one more practice. Here we're looking at a species of jopai weed. I'm not sure which one. They can be tough to tell apart. But are we looking at leaves that are alternate, opposite, whorled, and they're certainly not basal leaves only because we can tell they're making their way all the way up the stem here.
Whorled.
Whorled, yeah, exactly. Right, we can see those leaves sort of connecting all the way around the stem as we move from the bottom of the plant to the top. All right. Finally, when we're thinking about how to identify our flowers, how to put them into different categories, right, to get closer to that identification, we want to look at what we call leaf shape. And in this case, shape really is referring to the edges of the leaf and whether or not the leaf is entire or divided. So we've kind of mushed leaf shape and leaf margin or edges into one category. entire leaves are going to attach to the stem at what we call the petiole, and there will just be one leaf, right? So we've got our two entire leaves here on the left, and then on the right in our drawing we've got a divided leaf. So you can see where the leaf attaches to the stem, right? And then that little petiole comes up and there's smaller leaflets that branch off of it. And this can be tricky when it comes to tree identification as well as wildflower identification. Getting used to those divided leaves can be tough, but we can do it, right? So we're seeing an example of a plant with entire leaves that are smooth, right? Here when we're taking a look at false Solomon's seal. So when we're looking at these leaves, they are entire, they are not divided, and the edges of the leaf are nice and smooth. So for our purposes for wildflower ID, we're just going to put them into that entire category. Down here below our false Solomon's seal, we have the leaves of common jewelweed. And you can see these leaves are entire, but they have toothed or jagged edges. So we put them into the toothed category for the purpose of wildflower identification. And then over on the right, we've got our tall buttercup. Most of our buttercup species have what we call divided leaves. Again, right, the leaf comes out, the stem or the petiole of the leaf comes out, and then the leaf itself is divided into smaller leaflets. Okay, so we've got a divided leaf here. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I didn't have any practices for this one because I feel like this one is fairly straightforward. It's a little different if you're used to tree identification to think of it this way. Tree identification, you know, has the leaf shape and the leaf margins. Here we've sort of mushed them together to make things a little bit simpler for wildflower identification. Then finally, we want to think about, again, like we talked about, where your wildflowers are in terms of habitat. Where are you finding them growing? How tall are they? How large are the flowers themselves? What color are the flowers? And what season are they blooming? And I've included an example here of two plants that are pretty commonly confused, right? We've got our fleabane on the left and our asters on the right. They are both, you know, plants that don't get very tall, about a foot high. They've got white petals with lots of different parts. So what are we looking at here? And I say petals, meaning like petal-like parts. They are both composite flowers, so it's a little trickier, but they look very similar, right? But if you've got a plant that looks like this that's blooming in the springtime, you know it's not an aster, it's a fleabane. And if you've got a plant like this that's blooming in the fall, you know it's not a fleabane, it's an aster. Our asters bloom in the fall, our fleabanes bloom in the spring. Okay? All right. So now I wanted to just kind of walk us through some different flowers, and when we're thinking about those flower parts, right, what they might look like. So we're going to get a little more familiar with different flowers in our region, what those flowers look like, and how we might categorize those flowers based on the number of petal-like parts that they have. Okay, I really wanted to focus on this because we could look at pictures of wildflower leaves all day long and it wouldn't be that fun. I want to see the colorful blooms, and I'd imagine you do too. Okay, so when we're looking at wildflowers with what we call irregular flowers, right, remember those flowers that have bilateral symmetry, not radial symmetry. We can think of a couple of different genuses and families of flowers that fit this bill. A big one is our orchids, our violets, Dutchman's breeches and bleeding hearts, clovers, cardinal flowers and other lobelias, anything in the mint family, and then our speedwells, which are the teeny tiny blue flowers that you often find growing in lawns and yards early in the spring. On the right is a great example of an irregular flower, right? It's demonstrating that beautiful bilateral symmetry, but not radial symmetry. And this is our Jack in the Pulpit, right? Pretty common wildflower in the woods in our area, often growing where it's a little bit damp, I have found. And just a really beautiful example of an irregular flower. They really remind me of calla lilies, the way they kind of hang over like that and have the spadix that comes up. Quite beautiful. Just two examples of different violets, right? We often overlook our violets because we see them everywhere. I feel like everyone's yard or outdoor space has violets in it. You often find them growing in lawns, but we have almost 30 different species of violets in our area that are all native, and they are the host plant for butterflies in the fritillary family. And so they're a great little plant to have. Well, these are two examples of violets, and you can tell they don't really demonstrate that radial symmetry, right? All of these petal-like parts are not identical, but if we folded that violet in half, the two halves look quite similar. Okay. Again, our orchids and our Dutchman's breeches, right? This is called Showy Orcas, one of the more common orchids, often found growing in the woods. Dutchman's breeches, I have not found here at Gulf Branch or in Virginia yet. This picture is actually from the Arboretum. Found some Dutchman's breeches growing, probably planted at the Arboretum. But again, showing you that example of bilateral symmetry, right? They're not radially symmetrical flowers, right? They've got that beautiful bilateral symmetry that makes them a little bit different from so many of our other flowers. So we put them into that category of irregular when we're thinking about identification. Members of our lobelia family are Cardinal Flower, right? You often find this planted in rain gardens, likes to grow where it's a little swampy. Same with our great blue lobelia, growing in swampy areas. And then this little guy is called Indian tobacco. You can see my hand in the picture behind it. It has tiny white flowers, doesn't get more than 12 inches tall, but you will find it growing in the woods all around. It's certainly a common plant, just often overlooked because it's got such tiny little flowers, but it is in this same lobelia family. Next up are those plants in our mint group, right, which includes our bee balms, those plants in the Monarda genus. This is Scarlet Bee Bomb, a variety of bee balm, and we're looking at, each one of these red petal-like parts is its own flower, okay? And again, not radially symmetrical, okay, bilaterally symmetrical. Over on the right here, we have purple dead nettle, which is a common plant in lawns and yards, again with its cousin, Creeping Charlie, in the background behind it. These are not native plants, but they are some of our early bloomers, and these are tiny plants. They don't get more than probably 6 inches tall. They've got these tiny purple and pink flowers, again with that bilateral symmetry. I certainly would not plant purple dead nettle in a garden, but if the alternative is just grass that you're never going to let flower because you cut it, I might let the dead nettle grow until I decide to put in a native plant garden, because it does provide a source of pollen earlier in the year. Obviously, a native plant would be a better choice, but if the alternative is just turf grass, purple dead nettle isn't all bad. All right, so we're skipping over wildflowers that have two regular parts because they just don't really exist, right? There's not too many that we can put into that category. So we're going to move right along to wildflowers that have three regular parts, right, or petal-like structures. Wild ginger being a great example here on the right. Wild ginger has these wild-looking flowers that bloom under the leaves close to the ground, and they're pollinated by insects like ants that crawl into the flower and then crawl back out and then crawl into another flower and crawl back out. So they're really beautiful. Wildflowers that typically have three regular parts include our arrowheads, our irises, our trilliums, and our spiderworts. So let's take a look at some of those. Right. On the left here, top left, we have our Virginia spiderwort. There are tons of varieties of spiderwort that are sold in nurseries and greenhouses that you find in gardens all the time, right? But those three petals here really clue you in, and the long, slender leaves that this is a spiderwort. Our irises, right, have those three petal-like parts, 1, 2, 3. Our trilliums, of course, right, have a leaf with three parts and a flower with three parts. And then finally, those arrowheads, This is a plant called duck potato that grows in the wetlands in our area. The roots were traditionally harvested by native people and used sort of similarly to the way we eat and use potatoes today, right? They could be roasted, they could be boiled, but again, it's got those 3 petal-like parts. So we put it into that category when we're thinking about how to categorize what we have found.
That's a great name.
Duck potato, yeah. I mean, I think the ducks like the roots too, which is probably how it ended up with that name, but it's a great one. It has other common names, right? Sometimes you'll hear it called arrowhead. There's a few others that I don't know off the top of my head, but I like duck potato the best. Okay. Moving right along to wildflowers with 4 regular parts. These are our cranberries, our sundrops and primroses, our water primroses, all of the plants in the I can't even say it. It used to be called Cruciferae family, named for those 4 petal-like parts of the flower. But these are plants like our broccolis and our mustards and our cresses. And then finally the bed straws, right, that we saw earlier in the presentation. So over on the right here is a beautiful example of a flower with 4 petal-like parts, right? This is the Celandine Poppy, not to be confused with lesser celandine, which is another yellow flower, much smaller and actually invasive. Our Celandine Poppy is a totally different plant, just happens to have a similar common name. But it's native. This one was actually here at the Nature Center. Really beautiful. It has divided leaves, right? And then those 4 beautiful petal-like parts to its flower. Okay. On this page, we're looking at some of those plants in the mustard family. You can see that a number are non-native, right? This is creeping yellow crest that blooms pretty early in the spring, along with early yellow rocket. You'll find them again in weedy places, along roadsides, along paths, in lawns. Again, I've included some of these flowers because although they aren't like our showiest native flowers, they are some of the flowers that you will encounter. So that also includes hairy bittercrest down here, which is another one you'll find in lawns early in the year. And then finally our garlic mustard, which is a non-native invasive plant that we work to remove here in Arlington County. But they all have these tiny white or yellow clusters of flowers with the 4 petal-like parts. I think they're really pretty, especially early in the spring when there's not too much color to be found elsewhere. Obviously, we don't want garlic mustard in our parks. There are better choices, but still, you know, interesting to look at for sure. On this page, we have 2 examples of native toothworts. The cutleaf toothwort is more common than the 2-leaf toothwort in our area. I have actually not encountered these in the wild yet, although I'm hopeful I will one day. So these are not my images, right? In any instance in the presentation where there is an image that is not mine, I have provided credit to the photographer and included the link to where I found the photo. Otherwise, the photos are photos that I've taken. Our primroses, right, are examples of flowers that have 4 petal-like parts or petal-like structures, right? This is our little evening primrose here on the left, and then our common evening primrose here on the right. And then finally, I included this one just because I love it. This is a plant called seed box that typically grows in wet, sort of marshy areas. It has the 4 petal-like parts on its flower, but if you look at the seed pods also have that 4-part structure. This is maybe why we call them seed boxes, because it really does. The seeds look like they're encapsulated in the little 4-sided box, which I love. So sometimes, even if it's not the time of year where our flowers are blooming, you can still look at the seed structure, right, the pod, and tell that that flower had probably 4 parts, petal-like parts to it, because the seed pod has what appears to be 4 parts to it. And we're seeing that in our seed box here. Do we have questions so far before we keep going? This is going to be our largest group of flowers, right? These are our wildflowers that have what we call 5 regular parts, and a number of wildflowers fit into this little category. Our wild strawberries, our milkweeds, our mulleins, our mallows, our avens, buttercups, sorrels, phlox, chickweeds, geraniums, anemones, which is like our thimbleweed, right? Two great examples here, our spring beauty and our Indian strawberry. I will tell you that I did try to go through and under each picture, if it was a native plant, I didn't include an asterisk. If it was an introduced plant, I included 1 asterisk. And if it was an invasive, I included 2, but I made a mistake here with the Indian strawberry. The Indian strawberry is the little yellow flower with the teeny little strawberry that we find growing in our lawns, and it is introduced. It is not native, but we certainly do have native wild strawberries as well. Okay, we're looking at milkweeds, which again, when we see milkweed blossoms, we often see the whole big blossom, but when we zoom in up close, right, we can see each individual flower has 5 petal-like structures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whether it's common milkweed or butterfly weed or swamp milkweed. Dogbane is the same way, right? We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petal-like structures. This is when our magnifying glasses really come in handy. Hearing. Did someone have a question? No. Okay. On this page, we're looking at members of our avens genus. Most common in our area is what we call white avens, and it's just this sort of nondescript little white flower with divided leaves that grows in the woods. You'll find it often. Right, rough avens is a little less common and yellow avens even less so, but I did want to include them because they are such nice examples of, right, those 5-part flowers. Our common St. John's wort is another, right, all of our St. John's worts do typically have the 5 petal-like parts. In this picture on the left, right, it's a little tough to tell, right? Some of these flowers have lost parts. So that's always, right, something we've got to consider as well. Are we looking at a freshly blossomed flower, or has it bloomed for about 2 weeks and we're missing some parts? So it helps to look at the whole plant and take a look if there are any other plants in the area to really get a good sense of what we're seeing. Our mulleins, right, both of these plants are introduced but still fairly common, right? Our common mullein on the left, the one that gets really tall with those fuzzy lamb's ear-like leaves. And then Mothmaline, which is in the same family, looks quite different, but still has those same 5-petaled or 5-part flowers, 5-petaled flowers.
What time of year do these bloom?
Yeah, so our common mullein blooms a little bit later in the summertime. Mothmaline blooms a little bit earlier. I'm trying to think when I took that picture, and I think it was in like late May, probably late May, early June. And it doesn't get nearly as tall as the common mullein. It's probably, you know, a foot or 2 tall. And again, like the common mullein, grows sort of in weedy places, roadsides and the like. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the interesting things with the common mullein is that it's a biennial. So the first year you'll see it, it doesn't have flowers, but it's growing, and it gets quite big in the first year. And then the second year, it really takes off.
That's correct. And there are other flowers here that are also biennial. Garlic mustard being sort of the classic example, where in one year you'll just see the basal leaves, and then in the second year the plant gets quite tall and you'll see the flowers. So we're just focusing on the flowers for now. Okay. These are plants in our geranium family and the phlox family. Again, beautiful examples of flowers that have those 5 petals or 5 petal-like structures. We're running short on time here, so I'm just going to kind of roll through the rest of these. Moving on to our wildflowers with 6 regular parts, blue-eyed grasses, some of our hyacinths, daylilies, trout lilies, hepaticas, Solomon seals, wild onion and garlic sometimes, depends on the species. Right, and we've got some examples here. On the left is trout lily, and then also May apple, 2 of our spring ephemeral native wildflowers, right? Both of these flowers bloom and then finish blooming before the trees in the forest have all of their leaves. So they're just here really early in the springtime. out and about, right, before the trees have their leaves, when the sunlight can make its way all the way to the forest floor, which is where they bloom. On the left, we have non-native invasive flowers with 6 petal-like structures, right? Star of Bethlehem, which you often find growing in lawns, and then our orange daylily, which is planted, I think, everywhere. We find it everywhere, but in some instances, it has escaped cultivation and sort of spread outwards on its own. So kind of depending on who you talk to, some folks will say it's introduced, others will say it's invasive, but out of an abundance of caution, it's not one that I plant in my yard because I don't want it spreading into the woods near my house and taking the place of maybe some of these beautiful spring ephemerals. Next up are our wildflowers with 7 or more regular parts. This is where, when we were looking at the chicory, for example, and counting those parts, it still had parts that we could see individually, right? But we got to 7, and then maybe sometimes there were 10, maybe 11, maybe 8, right? Once we get past 7, we just kind of lump them all together. The key being that, like, we've gone past 7 regular parts, but we can still count distinct parts. Okay, so our hawkweeds, sunflowers, coneflowers, ragworts, and fleabanes. We're looking at bloodroot, which falls into this category. This is another native spring ephemeral, really beautiful, has really interesting leaves. I think the leaves are maybe more fascinating than the flower in this case, but really nice example, right, of those petals having 7 or more. Okay. These are some examples of flowers with 7 or more regular parts. We've got our woodland sunflower over on the left, and an example of a mammoth sunflower from my garden, right, which is an introduced cultivated sunflower variety of the Helianthus annuus, right, our annual sunflowers. But really nice example of those, right, parts, that petal-like parts that we can count individually, but there's definitely 7 or more of them. In the middle here, we have our cut-leaved coneflower. And then on the bottom left, we have golden ragwort. Okay. And these are sort of, I think of them as like our sunshine flowers. We can group them into, right, a kind of that category of plants that look like tiny little sunshines. Okay. Finally, our last category when we're thinking about the flowers themselves and the number of parts or petal-like structures are those that just have so many that it's hard to tell them apart, right? So this is different than our previous category where we could still count individual parts, even though there may have been a lot of them, right? In this case, there's just so many and they seem impossible to count. So our plantains, our snake roots, our joe pie weeds, our thistles and asters and goldenrods all fall into this category. On the right, you're looking at an example of an invasive thistle in our area. This is the Canada thistle. Really has the tendency to take over in fields and meadows. On the top left, you're looking at a species of joe pie weed being visited by a swallowtail. Top right is great ragweed, right? We often, I have found that folks often confuse ragweed and goldenrod. They are very different plants, as you'll see in just a minute. Ragweed has green flowers, goldenrod has yellow. Ragweed blooms in the spring and summer, goldenrod blooms in the fall. At some point, somewhere along the line, somebody got confused and confused everybody else, but ragweed is a much different plant. White snake root down on the bottom grows in abundance here in Arlington in our wooded areas. And then on the left is a plant called late flowering boneset. It's another one that you will often find kind of in weedy, roadside-y type places. And then finally, we have our goldenrods. Goldenrods are sort of notoriously difficult to identify. There are folks in the field that I know who only send their photos to goldenrod specialists to ID, and these are folks who have worked in the natural resources and native plant world for decades, and they're still not confident in their goldenrod ID. So sometimes you'd have to be comfortable with just saying, yeah, well, it's a goldenrod, right? It's blooming in the fall. It's got these beautiful yellow blossoms, and they have teeny tiny little parts that I can't even count. There's so many of them. One exception to that I find is the Zigzag Golden Rod, which grows in the shade in the woods, and its stem really does have this zigzag pattern, and compared to some of the other species of goldenrod, it just doesn't seem to have as many flowers, right? It's sort of less showy and definitely zigzaggy. So this is one I think that you can confidently ID. Some of the others, right, we might just have to say, yep, it's a goldenrod, good enough. Okay. All right, moving along here. I did want to just share with you resources for learning more. So I've really just given you a little tiny taste this evening. And I've tried to provide a little bit of a framework, right? We looked at flowers and the flower parts and how we can sort of group flowers into different categories based on the number of petal-like parts. And then we've also looked at leaf arrangement and leaf, what we call shape. Okay, and using those three things as sort of the foundation of our tripod, we can really narrow it down to figure out what we're looking at. We've got a flower, it has 5 parts, it's got opposite leaves, and those opposite leaves have toothed edges, right? And that will help us kind of narrow it down, and then we can start to look at other things like, okay, what time of year is it that it's blooming? How tall is the plant? Where am I finding it? Is it stem fuzzy? Is it stem not fuzzy? Okay, all of these things are going to kind of clue us in, but those 3 give us sort of the structure or the framework. So I would recommend Newcomb's guide as a start, right? That's where this framework comes from. But there's also the Peterson's guide to wildflowers that has sort of a different framework. It goes by color of flower. The National Audubon Society, of course, has a guide to wildflowers. If you're really interested in getting very technical, the Flora of Virginia is sort of the plant Bible for the state of Virginia. I would say it's great for learning more, but it's not great necessarily for sort of basic beginner identification. And then you'll see a number of websites that I've included. I really love the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, as well as the Maryland Biodiversity Project for learning more about what wildflowers can be found in our area. Virginia is not too different from Maryland most of the time. And there's great information there on bloom time and whether or not something is invasive, etc. Okay.